The transport ship shuddered as it locked into the docking clamp of Verath Prime, and Sergeant Mara Kessler grabbed her single duffel bag and stood before the airlock, even hissed open. She had traveled 11 weeks through deep space to reach the Galactic Coalition's most elite military academy, and she was ready to get her boots on solid ground. The station world was massive, a spinning ring of metal and glass and artificial gravity that housed over 200,000 beings from across the galaxy. Mara stepped off the transport ramp and into a corridor that smelled like recycled air and something faintly chemical. She had smelled worse in the barracks back in Norway during Arctic training, so she barely noticed. A holographic sign directed new candidates toward Processing Hall 9. She followed it, walking past clusters of alien soldiers who towered over her or skittered alongside her on too many legs. She kept her eyes forward and her breathing steady. Long time ago, that the first day at any new posting was about watching and listening, not talking. Processing Hall 9 was enormous. The ceiling rose so high that smaller flying species were actually gliding between the upper support beams. Below them stood hundreds of candidates from dozens of worlds. Mara spotted a group of Syraxians near the front, their forearms folded across their insectoid chest plates, with an air of absolute authority. Behind them stood a cluster of massive Urloks, their stone-colored skin cracked with natural patterns that looked like dry riverbeds. To her left, a pack of Rethari moved with quick vulpine grace, their ears twitching at every sound. Mara found an open spot near the middle of the hall, dropped her bag, and began stretching her shoulders. She had been sitting in a cramped transport bunk for 3 days, and her joints ached. She rolled her neck and felt it pop twice. A Rethari turned at the sound and stared at her with wide amber eyes. "Did something break inside you?" he asked. "No," Mara said, "just stiff from the ride." The Rethari blinked slowly, his ears flattened and then rose again. "You are the human," he said. "One of them," Mara replied, "but I think I might be the only one here." "You are," he confirmed. His tone made it clear he found this fact puzzling rather than impressive. "I am Takani, Rethari Forward Assault Corps. I have been assigned to Squad 14 with you. Mara Kessler, Earth Arctic Warfare Division." Takani looked her up and down. She was shorter than him by half a head. Her skin was pale and scarred across the knuckles and forearms. She had no claws, no armor plating, no venom glands, and no visible natural weapons of any kind. He had read the human species file on the way here. It had listed them as Tier 3, which meant moderate threat at best. "I mean no offense," Takani said carefully, "but I am not certain why they accepted a human for Vanguard." Mara finished stretching and looked at him. "Guess we will find out," she said. A deep rumbling voice interrupted them from behind. "Move aside, small ones." They turned to find an Urlok standing over them like a boulder that had learned to walk. He was nearly 3 meters tall, and his stone skin was dark gray, with orange fracture lines running along his arms. His eyes were deep-set, and the color of molten iron. "Gorath," he said. "Urlok Heavy Siege Corps Squad 14. "That makes 3 of us," Mara said. She looked up at him the same way she looked at everything else, with calm and steady attention. Gorath studied her for a moment, and then grunted. He respected the fact that she did not flinch, even if he did not yet respect much else about her. A sharp tone rang through the hall, and every conversation died instantly. A figure strode onto the raised platform at the front of the room. It was a Syraxian, tall and angular, with gleaming black exoskeletal plating and 4 arms clasped behind his back. His mandibles clicked once for silence, even though the room was already quiet. "I am Instructor Dren Votha," he said, and his voice carried like a blade through still air. "You are here because your homeworlds believe you are exceptional. I am here because the Coalition needs me to determine if that belief is justified. In most cases, it will not be." He paused and let the silence do its work. "In 3 days you will be deployed to the surface of Shalvor," Votha continued. A holographic image flickered to life behind him, showing a gray and hostile moon, covered in swamps and volcanoes and frozen canyons. The Crucible of Shalvor is a 7-day endurance gauntlet across the most lethal terrain this system has to offer. You will cross acid marshlands, volcanic ridgelines, frozen canyon networks, and open predator valleys. You will do so with limited supplies and no extraction until you reach the finish beacon, or until your vitals confirm death. A murmur rippled through the hall. Votha ignored it. The historical fatality rate for the Crucible is 18%, he said. Those who survive and reach the beacon earn automatic Vanguard candidacy. Those who do not are either dead or disqualified. There is no middle ground. He dismissed the hologram with a flick of one arm. Briefing packets have been uploaded to your squad terminals. You have 3 days to prepare. Use them. The hall began to empty. Takani looked pale beneath his fur. Gorath cracked his massive knuckles slowly, which was either his way of showing nerves or excitement, and Mara could not yet tell which. Mara pulled up the briefing on her wrist display and scrolled through it in silence. She read about the acid fog in the marshlands, and the 70-degree heat on the volcanic slopes, and the -60 temperatures in the frozen canyons. She read about the megafauna in the final valley. Shuttlecraft with bio-armor and territorial aggression. She read the supply limits and the medical restrictions and the rules of engagement, which were simple. There were none. Takani watched her read. "You are very calm," he said, and it sounded almost like an accusation. Mara looked up from the display. "Can I ask something about the course?" she said. "What?" Takani asked. But she was not talking to him. She had turned toward a passing logistics officer, a small four-eyed Pelinari with a data tablet. "The briefing mentions 12,000 meters of total elevation gain over the 7 days, Mara said. "Is that cumulative or net?" The officer blinked all 4 eyes. "Cumulative," she said. "Thanks," Mara said. She closed the display, pulled a ration pack from her duffel, and started eating. Takani stared at her. "That is your only question?" Mara chewed and swallowed. "The rest is just weather and terrain," she said. "I have done weather and terrain before." "You have done a course like this before?" Takani asked, his ears pointing straight up. Mara thought about selection back on Earth. She thought about the Brecon beacons in winter, and the endless marches with 60-pound packs, and the instructors who were paid to break you in ways that left no marks. She thought about the candidates who quit at 3 in the morning in freezing rain, because their bodies simply could not convince their minds to keep going. "Something like it," she said. She finished her ration, packed the wrapper neatly into her bag, and stood. "I am going to find our quarters and get some sleep. 3 days goes fast." She walked away without waiting for a response. Takani watched her go, and then looked at Gorath. "She is either very brave or very stupid," Takani said. Gorath watched the small human disappear through the corridor door. She moved like someone who had been tired before, and had learned that tired was not a limit. Reason to stop. "Perhaps," Gorath said slowly, "she is something else entirely." In his command office high above the hall, Instructor Votha pulled up the species file for Homo sapiens. He scrolled through the data and found nothing remarkable. No armor, no venom, no regeneration. Average speed, below average strength relative to body mass. Limited sensory range, and a homeworld classified as a mid-range death world only by technicality. He closed the file and made a note beside Squad 14, probable early elimination. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. The drop pod hit the surface of Shalvor like a fist, and the squad was thrown against their harnesses hard enough to rattle teeth. The door blew open, and the air that rushed in was warm and wet, and smelled like burning metal. Mara was the first one out. She dropped to one knee and scanned the landscape in every direction. The acid marshlands stretched to the horizon, a flat and endless expanse of dark water and pale green fog that hung low over everything, like a living thing. The ground was soft and dark, and hissed faintly wherever the fog touched exposed soil. "Masks on," Mara said without looking back. "The fog is acidic, according to the briefing. Skin contact within 30 minutes causes chemical burns." Tikani pulled his filtration mask over his muzzle, and Gorath wrapped a treated cloth around his face. The three of them moved out in a loose formation, with Mara on point, Tikani in the middle, and Gorath bringing up the rear. By the end of the first hour, they could hear other squads in the distance. Some were arguing about direction. Others were already calling for extraction. 3 emergency beacons lit up on Mara's wrist display before noon, and each one meant a squad had quit or been pulled out due to critical injury. The fog thickened as they moved deeper into the marsh. Tikani was the first to notice the burning. He stopped and looked down at his forearms, where the fur had begun to change color, turning from russet to a sick yellowish white. The acid in the air was eating through the outer layer of his coat. "It is getting through the mask seal," Tikani said, and his voice was tight with the effort of staying calm. "My species was not built for this kind of atmosphere." Mara stopped and turned. She looked at his arms and then at the ground. She knelt and dug her fingers into the dark mud beneath the waterline. She brought up a handful and smelled it, then squeezed it and watched the residue on her glove. "Alkaline," she said. "Basic enough to neutralize the acid." She stripped off her outer jacket, soaked it in the mud until it was heavy and dark, and then wrapped it around Tikani's forearms and neck, where the exposure was worst. Tikani looked at the muddy fabric on his skin, and then at Mara, who was now standing in just her base layer, with her bare arms exposed to the fog. "You will burn," he said. "I will manage," she said. "Humans shed skin and regrow it. We are used to damage. Move out." He stared at her for a moment longer, and then followed. 4 more beacons lit up on the display behind them. They made it through the marshlands by nightfall, and Mara's arms were red and raw and stinging, but she said nothing about it. She cleaned the burns with water from her canteen, wrapped them with strips from her undershirt, and kept walking. Day 2 brought the volcanic ridgeline. The transition was brutal. Within 2 hours, the temperature climbed from the swampy warmth of the marshlands to a crushing 70 degrees on the exposed rock. The ground was black and sharp and radiated heat like an oven. The air shimmered and tasted like sulfur. Gorath handled it well at first. His stone skin was built for heat and pressure, and he moved with confidence across the broken terrain. But by midday, even he was slowing. The thermal stress was causing microfractures along his arm plates, tiny cracks that spread like spider webs under the relentless heat. He said nothing about it because Urlox did not complain, but Mara noticed the way he kept flexing his fingers. Tikani was worse. The Rethari was panting with his mouth open and his tongue out, trying desperately to cool himself. His species had fur and no sweat glands, and the heat was cooking him from the outside in. He stumbled twice on the ascent, and the second time he did not get up immediately. "I cannot regulate my temperature," he said from the ground. His amber eyes were glassy. "Not designed for this." Mara knelt beside him and poured water over his head and neck. "Rest for 5 minutes," she said. "Then we move again." "How?" Tikani asked, and he was not asking about the plan. He was asking how she was still standing. She was drenched in sweat from head to toe. Her hair was plastered to her skull, and her clothes were soaked through and dark patches spread across every surface of fabric on her body. She looked absolutely miserable. "Human sweat," she said. "It is our cooling system. Water comes out through our skin and evaporates and takes heat with it. It is the most efficient thermoregulation system on record for any land-based species in the Coalition database." Tikani looked horrified. "You are leaking fluid from your entire body." "Yes." "And this is normal for your kind?" "Yes. We evolved to chase prey across open savanna in the heat until the prey collapsed from overheating. We did not need to be faster. We just needed to not stop. Tikani lay on the hot rock and considered the idea of a species that had evolved specifically to outlast its prey through sheer stubborn refusal to die from heat. It was one of the most terrifying things he had ever heard. They made it over the ridgeline by evening. Mara had consumed 4 liters of water, and her lips were cracked, and her eyes were bloodshot, but she was still moving. Gorath's leg plate cracked badly on the descent, a deep fracture that ran from his knee to his ankle. He went down hard, and the sound he made was not a scream, but something deeper, a grinding noise that came from his chest, like stone breaking. "Leave me," Gorath said immediately. "Standard doctrine says injured members who cannot maintain pace are to be left at a recovery point for post-course extraction. I will activate my beacon." "No," Mara said. Gorath looked at her with his molten eyes. "I am 340 kilograms. I cannot walk. You cannot carry me. Choice you get to make." Mara was already moving. She pulled a flat piece of volcanic glass from the ground and tested its edge. Then she cut strips from her pack frame and her remaining gear webbing and fashioned a rigid splint around Gorath's fractured leg plate. She bound it tight and braced it with 2 straight pieces of rock wedged along either side. "Can you put weight on it?" she asked. Gorath tried. He stood, and the pain made his vision blur, but the splint held. "Some," he said. "Then we go slow," Mara said. She got under his left arm and braced herself against his weight, which was like trying to support a wall. She looked at Tikani. "Get under his other side." "This is foolish," Tikani said, but he was already moving into position. "Probably," Mara said. "Move out." They marched through the night. Mara's shoulders screamed, and her knees ached, and something in her lower back felt like it was being slowly torn apart, but she kept her breathing steady and put one foot in front of the other, the way she had been taught, the way she had always done it. Gorath looked down at the small human, holding up a fraction of his impossible weight, and he asked the question that had been building in him since the marsh. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you are my squad," Mara said, and she said it like it was the simplest and most obvious truth in the universe. In the orbital monitoring station above Shalvor, Instructor Votha sat in front of a wall of biometric displays. He had pulled up Squad 14's data out of mild curiosity, and what he found made him lean forward in his chair. Mara Kessler's cortisol levels were through the roof. Her inflammatory markers were spiking across every joint in her body. She had micro tears in both rotator cuffs, early signs of stress fractures in her feet, chemical burns on her arms, and her caloric deficit was approaching dangerous levels. Her body was, by every objective measure, falling apart. She had not reported a single complaint. She had not slowed her pace. She had not left her injured squadmate behind. Votha pulled up the biometric comparison charts for every other human who had ever attended the academy. There had only been 4, and none had made it past the crucible. He stared at the data for a long time, and then he opened Mara's file and added a single note: "Monitor closely." It was the first time he had ever written that about a Tier 3 species. A cold arrived like a wall. One moment the ground was warm and dark from the volcanic zone, and the next the air turned sharp and thin, and the temperature dropped so fast that frost began forming on Tikani's whiskers within minutes. The frozen canyon network of Shalvor stretched ahead of them, a maze of ice-covered ravines and sheer cliff walls that rose hundreds of meters on either side, blocking out the weak gray sun. Mara stopped at the edge of the first canyon and studied the terrain below. Wind howled through the narrow passages, and she could see ice formations hanging from the walls like teeth. She pulled her collar up around her neck and tightened every strap and seal on her remaining gear. Stay close, she said. The wind will cut through you faster than anything we have faced so far. Takani was already shaking. His Rethari fur was designed for temperate forests, not polar extremes. The outer layer provided some insulation, but the wind was finding every crack, gap, and driving cold into his muscles like needles. He clamped his jaw shut to stop his teeth from chattering, and it barely helped. Gorath was worse. The Urlok's stone skin, which had been an asset in the heat, was now a lethal liability. Cold made it brittle. The microfractures from the volcanic ridge were spreading, and every step produced faint cracking sounds that made Mara's stomach tighten. His movements became stiff and slow, like a machine running out of power. "My skin is losing structural integrity," Gorath said, and his deep voice was quieter than Mara had ever heard it. "If the temperature drops further, I will begin to fragment." "It will drop further," Mara said honestly, "so we need shelter before nightfall." She led them down into the canyon and began scanning the walls for the right formation. She was looking for something specific, a concave overhang with a snowdrift at its base and protection from the prevailing wind. She found it 40 minutes later. Natural alcove, carved into the ice wall by centuries of wind erosion. "Here," she said, and she started digging. Takani and Gorath watched as Mara cut blocks of compressed snow from the drift using a flat piece of volcanic glass she had carried from the ridge. She stacked them in a curved wall across the mouth of the alcove, angling them inward to create a sealed chamber with a small entrance tunnel at the bottom. She packed loose snow into the gaps and smoothed the interior walls. "What is this?" Takani asked. "Snow shelter," Mara said. "Humans have been building these for thousands of years on Earth. The snow insulates against the wind and traps body heat inside. The interior will stay around -5, even if the outside drops to -60. It will not be comfortable, but it will keep us alive." She finished the structure in under an hour and ushered them both inside. Gorath barely fit, but once all three of them were inside, with the entrance blocked, temperature difference was immediate. The howling wind became a muffled whisper, and the air inside slowly warmed from their combined body heat. Takani pressed close to Gorath's bulk, absorbing the residual warmth that the Urlok's body still radiated from the volcanic zone. Mara sat at the entrance, with her back against the snow wall, and her knees drawn up. She was cold, but she was managing. She had trained in Arctic conditions for 3 years on Earth, and this was familiar territory for her, in a way that nothing else on Shalvor had been. "Your species built shelters from frozen water," Gorath said slowly, as if he was trying to understand a concept that fundamentally did not fit into his worldview. "We built shelters from whatever was available," Mara said. "Ice, mud, stone, wood, animal skins, leaves. We colonized every climate on our homeworld. The deserts and the jungles, and the mountains and the frozen poles. Every place that should have killed us, we moved into." "Refused to leave?" Takani asked. "Why?" Mara thought about it. "Because it was there," she said, "and because someone told us we could not." They slept in shifts. Mara took first watch and sat in the entrance tunnel with the volcanic glass blade across her knees. She listened to the wind and the distant sounds of the canyon, the creak of ice expanding, the occasional rumble of a far-off avalanche, and something else, something that clicked and scraped against rock with a rhythm that was too deliberate to be natural. She reached back and tapped Gorath's arm twice. He woke instantly and silently, which was impressive for someone his size. "Something is out there," Mara whispered, "moving on the ice, multiple legs." Gorath listened, and then he heard it too. The clicking of hard appendages on frozen stone, growing closer. "Canyon arthropods," he said. "The briefing mentioned them. Ambush predators. They hunt in packs, and they are drawn to heat signatures." Looked at their shelter, which was warmer than the surrounding ice by a significant margin. They were a beacon. "Wake, Takani," she said quietly. The attack came fast. The first arthropod burst through the snow wall to the left of the entrance. It was the size of a large dog, but built like a nightmare, segmented and pale white, with 6 hooked legs and a pair of crushing mandibles that could crack Urlach's stone skin. Its body was nearly invisible against the ice, and it moved with horrifying speed. Takani screamed as it lunged at him, and its mandibles closed around his left arm. He thrashed and kicked, but the creature's grip was locked, and it began to drag him toward the breach in the wall. Mara did not hesitate. She launched herself at the arthropod and drove the volcanic glass blade into the joint between its head and thorax. The creature screeched and released Takani, but it twisted, and one of its hooked legs raked across Mara's ribs, tearing through her base layer, and opening a deep gash that immediately ran red with blood. She did not stop. She grabbed the creature's head with both hands, found the nerve cluster behind its mandible joint that she had memorized from the fauna briefing on day 1, and drove her thumb into it with everything she had. The arthropod convulsed once and went limp. 2 more were coming through the breach. Gorath roared and swung his massive arm into the first one, sending it crashing into the canyon wall with a sound like shattering pottery. Takani, bleeding from his arm but moving on pure adrenaline, used his speed to flank the second and drove a sharpened piece of ice into its underbelly. The attack was over in less than a minute. Mara sat back against the wall and looked down at the wound on her ribs. It was deep and bleeding freely. She could see the white edge of bone through the torn flesh. She pressed her hand against it, and her jaw tightened. "Medical kit," she said. She opened the kit with one hand and pulled out the emergency cauterizer, a small heated element designed for sealing wounds in the field. She pressed it against the gash, and the sound it made was something none of them would ever forget. Mara's hand shook. The tendons in her neck stood out like cables, and she made a single short sound through her clenched teeth that was not quite a scream and not quite a grunt. When she pulled the cauterizer away, the wound was sealed, ugly and red and puckered, but no longer bleeding. She stood up. Takani stared at her. "What are you doing?" "Taking watch," she said. "There might be more of them." "You just sealed an open wound on your own body." "Yes, and now I am taking watch." Takani sat in the dim shelter and watched the human limp to the entrance and lower herself into position, with the blade across her knees again. He realized that his hands were trembling, and hers were not. "Mara," he said, very softly, quietly. She looked back at him. "What are your people?" he asked. She smiled, and it was tired and tight and real. "Stubborn," she said. Outside, the wind screamed through the canyons, and the temperature fell to -58, and somewhere in the darkness, more arthropods clicked and scraped across the ice. Mara watched the entrance and did not sleep, and her blood dried brown against the makeshift bandage on her ribs, and she did not move from her post until morning. When Gorath woke at dawn, he found her still sitting there, with her eyes open and the blade still ready. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he spoke a word in Urlach that Mara had never heard before. "Kreshvalan," he said. "What does that mean?" she asked. "Iron blood," Gorath said. "It is a title among my people, given only to warriors who have looked at death and refused it. You are Kreshvalan, Mara Kessler of Earth." Mara nodded once. She did not know what to say to that, so she said the most human thing possible. "Thank you. Now help me pack up. We have a long walk today." They moved out into the frozen canyon as the pale sun rose above the ice walls. 3 soldiers, battered and bleeding and frozen and still moving, because one of them simply did not know how to stop, and the other 2 had decided they would follow her until she did. Day 6 began with silence. The frozen canyons had released them sometime during the night, and Squad 14 emerged onto a high ridge overlooking the final stretch of the Crucible. Below them lay a vast open valley, wide and golden brown, with tall alien grass that swayed in a wind that carried the smell of ozone and something animal. The finished beacon pulsed on the far ridge, a faint blue light that flickered against the darkening sky. Between them and that light was everything Shalvor had left to throw at them. Mara crouched on the ridge and studied the valley with the same quiet focus she had carried since day one. Her face was gaunt, and her cheeks were hollow, and the dark circles under her eyes made her look 10 years older than she was. The cauterized wound on her ribs had crusted over, but it pulled painfully every time she breathed. The chemical burns on her arms had blistered and broken and healed into rough red patches. Her feet hurt in a way that suggested something structural had gone wrong inside her boots days ago. She had not slept more than 90 minutes at a stretch since they had landed on this moon. 6 days. That was 144 hours of near-constant movement and threat and pain and decision-making on a body that was running on willpower and muscle memory, because everything else had been used up a long time ago. "How many squads are left?" Tikani asked. He was crouched beside her, and his voice was hoarse. His injured arm was wrapped in strips from Mara's kit, and he held it close to his chest, but he was still moving. Mara checked her wrist display. 11 out of 40. 2 dropped out in the canyons overnight. "And ahead of us?" Gorath asked. The Urlock was standing, because sitting down and getting back up had become a process he preferred to avoid. His splinted leg held but barely, and every step was a negotiation between his will and his fractures. 3 squads entered the valley before us, Mara said. She pointed to 2 clusters of emergency beacons blinking on the display. 2 of those squads hit something bad. Their beacons are active, which means they are alive but pulled out. They failed. She pointed to a 3rd cluster where the beacons were dark and still. That squad's beacons are offline. Tikani understood the silence that followed. Offline beacons meant the transponders had been destroyed, which meant the candidates wearing them had been destroyed too. "What killed them?" Tikani asked. "The Valley Alpha," Mara said. She had been reading the fauna section of the briefing every night while the others slept, memorizing patterns and behaviors and weaknesses. The briefing calls it a Gorin, a territorial apex predator, 6 legs, bioarmored skull and spine, approximately the size of a coalition shuttle. It owns this valley, and it does not share. She pulled up the topographic scan of the valley floor and traced lines with her finger. The 2 squads that failed tried to fight it head-on. There are weapons discharge residues near their beacon sites. They hit it, and it was not enough. The squad that died tried to sneak past. There is a narrow corridor along the eastern wall that looks like it provides cover, but the Gorin's sensory range covers it completely. It was a trap that looked like a path. "Then how do we cross?" Gorath said. Mara did not answer immediately. She sat on that ridge for 2 full hours, watching the valley below, while Tikani and Gorath rested. She watched the grass move and the wind shift. She watched a flock of small flying creatures change direction suddenly near the valley center, and she marked the spot where they turned. She watched the Gorin itself emerge from a depression near the eastern wall, a massive 6-legged thing with a skull plate the color of rust, and a body that moved with terrible fluid power despite its size. It walked a slow circuit through the grass, stopped at 3 specific points, and then returned to its depression. Mara watched it make that circuit twice. "It is territorial, but predictable," she said finally. "It patrols a fixed route, and it marks specific points. That means it navigates by scent and ground vibration more than sight. The flying creatures change direction at the edge of its sensory range, which gives us a boundary we can map. It does not patrol the western corridor because the wind there blows away from it, which means scent does not carry in that direction." Tikani looked at her. "You determined all of this by watching grass move?" "I determined all of this by being patient," Mara said. "Patience is a weapon. Every animal on Earth, and apparently on Shalvor too, has patterns. If you watch long enough, you find them." She laid out the plan. Gorath would move to the eastern ridge, above the Gorin's depression, and at a specific time he would begin striking the rock face with his stone fists, creating deep, rhythmic vibrations that would mimic a territorial challenge. The Goron would investigate, because it would have to. Anything that sounded like a rival in its territory demanded a response. While the Goron moved east, Tikani would use his Rethari speed to sprint north along the valley floor, drawing a visible line of movement that the creature's peripheral senses might detect. This would create a secondary point of confusion, splitting the Goron's attention between two stimuli on opposite sides of its range. And Mara would walk straight through the middle. She would move slowly through the western corridor, where the wind blew her scent away. She would carry the scent glands of the canyon arthropod she had killed 2 days ago, which she had cut out and preserved in a sealed pouch because she had learned a very long time ago that you never threw away anything that might be useful later. The arthropod's scent would mask her human signature, and if the Goron detected anything at all, dead scavenger, not a living intruder. You will walk through the hunting ground of a creature that killed an entire squad, Tikani said, and it was not a question. Slowly, Mara said, that is the important part. Running triggers pursuit. Walking does not. And if it detects you anyway? Gorath asked. Then I will deal with that when it happens, Mara said. The plan should not have worked. Every tactical manual in the Coalition said that a 3-person squad had no business attempting to outmaneuver a Class 7 apex predator with improvised tools and no heavy weapons. Every risk assessment model would have flagged it as suicidal, but the models did not account for Mara Kessler. Gorath moved into position, and at the agreed time he struck the eastern cliff face with both fists. The sound rolled through the valley like thunder. The Goron rose from its depression and turned east, its massive head swinging toward the sound. Its body tensed, and it began to move. Tikani ran. He was fast, even injured, and he cut a visible trail through the tall grass to the north. The Goron paused, and its head swiveled between the vibration to the east and the movement to the north. 2 threats, 2 directions. Its territorial instincts warred with each other, and for a critical window of time, it stayed frozen, caught between 2 responses. Mara walked. She moved through the western corridor with the arthropod scent pouch open in her hand. She kept her breathing slow and her steps even, and she did not look at the Goron. She looked at the ground in front of her, and she placed each foot carefully, and she walked the way humans had walked across the African savanna 200,000 years ago, steady and patient and relentless. The grass parted around her, and the wind carried her scent west, away from the predator, and her heartbeat was so loud in her own ears that she was certain the whole valley could hear it. But she did not speed up, not run. She trusted the plan, and she trusted her body, and she walked. She reached the far side of the valley in 22 minutes. She activated a signal flare, and Tikani sprinted toward her position, while Gorath descended from the eastern ridge and circled wide. The Goron turned toward the flare, but by the time it arrived at the corridor entrance, all 3 of them were past its territorial boundary and climbing the far ridge toward the beacon. Tikani collapsed at the top of the ridge and lay on his back, staring at the sky. His whole body was shaking. That was the most insane thing I have ever been part of, he said. Gorath sat heavily beside him, and his fractured leg finally gave a grinding crack that made Mara wince. It was insane, the Urlok agreed, and it worked. Mara stood between them and looked at the finished beacon pulsing on the next ridge over. One more climb, one more push. Can you both make it? She asked. Tikani sat up, stood. Yes, they said together. In the orbital station, Instructor Votha replayed the valley crossing for the 3rd time. He watched the human walk calmly through the kill zone of a Class 7 predator, using nothing but patience and arthropod glands, and an understanding of animal behavior that bordered on preternatural. He opened the human species file and stared at the threat classification for a long time. Then he placed his cursor in the assessment field and began typing a revision. He did not finish it yet, because he was not yet sure what to write. He only knew that Tier 3 was no longer accurate, and he suspected that no existing tier would be. The Finnish beacon stood on a flat gray platform at the top of the final ridge. It was a simple thing, a metal post with a pulsing blue light and a biometric scanner that would record the identity of anyone who touched it. 7 days of death and suffering, and the end of it all was a pole with a light on it. Mara thought that was fitting. The hardest things always ended quietly. Squad 14 crested the ridge in the last hours of Day 7. Mara was in front, because she had been in front since the beginning. Takani walked behind her, with his injured arm pressed against his side, and his ears flat against his skull from exhaustion. Gorath came last, each step on his fractured leg, a private war between bone and will that he fought in silence. The sky above Shalvor was the color of iron, and the wind had died down to nothing. The world was still, as if the moon itself had decided to stop and watch. Mara reached the beacon first. She stood in front of it, and waited. Together, she said. Takani and Gorath reached her side, and for a moment the three of them just stood there, looking at the blue light. They were filthy and broken and barely upright, and not one of them would have traded this moment for anything. They placed their hands on the scanner at the same time. The beacon flashed white, and a tone sounded across the ridge, a clear high note that echoed off the canyon walls behind them. The biometric scanner recorded 3 names, 3 species, 3 heartbeats that were still going, despite everything that had tried to stop them. Mara sat down on the platform because her legs had finally decided they were finished. She sat with her back against the beacon post and her hands in her lap, and she smiled, a small, tired, honest smile that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with being done. 7 squads, Takani said. He had checked the display. Out of 40, only 7 finished. He paused. Only 2 finished, with all members intact. Which 2? Mara asked. Us, he said. And a Syraxian heavy assault squad that had a medic and a full field surgery kit. We had Mara, Gorath said, and the way he said it made it sound like the same thing. The extraction shuttle arrived within the hour and carried them back to Verath Prime. The ride was quiet. All 3 of them fell asleep before the shuttle cleared the atmosphere, and the medical team that met them at the dock had to wake them with gentle persistence. The medical bay was cold and bright and smelled like antiseptic. Mara was placed on a scanning bed, and the diagnostic array went to work cataloging the damage. The attending physician was a Pellinari, a species known for their deep empathy and their tendency to feel the pain of others as a faint echo of their own. She read Mara's results, and her 4 eyes widened, 1 pair at a time. 2 hairline fractures in the metatarsal bones of both feet, a partially torn rotator cuff in her left shoulder, 2nd-degree chemical burns across both forearms in various stages of healing, a deep cauterized laceration across her right rib cage that had been sealed in field conditions and would need to be reopened and properly treated. Severe sleep deprivation, with cumulative deficit estimated at over 30 hours. Early-stage rhabdomyolysis from sustained muscle breakdown under extreme physical load. Caloric deficit of approximately 9,000 calories. Moderate dehydration despite continuous water intake. The Pellinari set down the datapad and looked at Mara with an expression that mixed professional concern with something very close to fear. Sergeant Kessler, she said carefully, you have been operating with injuries that would have triggered automatic medical evacuation for any other species in the coalition. At what point during the course did you become aware of the fractures in your feet? Day 3, Mara said. Maybe day 2. Sure, at first. You walked on fractured feet for 5 days. 4.5. The last half day was more of a limp. The Pellinari opened her mouth and then closed it. She looked at the datapad again, as if hoping the numbers had changed. They had not. "When can I start rehabilitation?" Mara asked. The physician stared at her for a long time, and then made a note in the file that simply read, "Human endurance parameters exceed all existing coalition medical models. Recommend updated baseline study." 3 days later, the surviving candidates gathered in the main briefing hall for the official debrief and assessment. Instructor Votha stood on the platform where he had first announced the crucible, and he looked out at the candidates who remained. They were fewer now, and quieter, and many of them carried visible marks of what they had survived. Votha began with the statistics. He listed the squads that had completed the course, and those that had not. Dead, without emotion, because honoring them meant stating truth, not decorating it. He reviewed the performance metrics and the tactical assessments, and when he had finished with the general overview, he turned to specific evaluations. He worked through several squads before he reached Squad 14. When he said the designation, Mara noticed that the room shifted. Every candidate who had been on Shalvor turned to look at her. Some had heard stories during the extraction process. Others had seen the data on the monitoring feeds. The human who carried the Urlach, the human who walked through the Goran's Valley, the human who cauterized her own wounds and took watch afterward. Votha looked directly at Mara. "Sergeant Kessler," he said, "your tactical decisions during the Crucible were among the most adaptive this Academy has recorded. Your squad survival rate is 100% in a course designed to produce casualties. I have one question for the record. How did you prepare for the Crucible of Shalvor?" Mara considered the question. "I did not," she said. "Not specifically." A murmur went through the hall. Votha raised one hand, and it stopped. "Explain," he said. "Where I come from," Mara said, "on Earth, our military special forces have a selection course that lasts between 2 and 4 weeks, depending on the branch. Candidates carry loads of 25 to 40 kilograms over mountainous terrain in all weather conditions. The marches can exceed 60 kilometers in a single stretch, with no defined route and no support. Sleep is restricted to 2 hours or less per night for days at a time. Instructors use deliberate psychological pressure, including simulated capture and interrogation, designed to break your will without leaving permanent physical damage. The failure rate is between 70 and 90%, depending on the year." She paused and looked around the hall. "I completed that selection when I was 21. Was 24 years old. I then served 3 years in Arctic conditions, where winter training exercises involved operating in -40 temperatures for weeks at a time, with minimal shelter and reduced rations." She looked at Votha. "The Crucible was 7 days. It was hard and it was dangerous, but it was shorter than what I have already survived. It reminded me of a training exercise." The hall was completely silent. Mara did not say this with arrogance or pride. She said it the way she said everything, simply and honestly, and without decoration. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was answering a question. Takani, who was sitting 3 rows back, felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He looked around and saw the same expression on every alien face in the room. It was the expression of a predator, realizing it has been standing next to something far more dangerous than itself. Gorath, who understood warriors better than most, recognized something even. The human was not boasting. She was confused about why anyone would think the Crucible was exceptional. That was the terrifying part. She considered this level of suffering to be normal. Votha held Mara's gaze for a long moment, and then nodded once. "Thank you, Sergeant. That will be all." The debrief ended, and the candidates filed out, and the hall emptied until only Votha remained. He stood at the platform console and opened the file he had been revising for days. The Human Species Assessment. He deleted the Tier 3 classification. He deleted the Moderate Threat designation. He deleted every line that suggested humans were average or unremarkable, or limited. He typed a new classification: species, human, Homo sapiens, homeworld, Earth, Sol system. Threat classification, ungraded, insufficient ceiling detected. Physical profile: no natural armor, no venom, no regeneration, below average strength to mass ratio, limited sensory range. Addendum: the above profile is accurate and irrelevant. This species compensates for every biological deficit through adaptability, persistence, cooperative bonding, and an endurance threshold that exceeds any reliable metric available to the Coalition. They do not specialize, they do not quit, they do not leave their own behind. Their definition of survivable conditions appears to have no meaningful upper boundary. He added one final note at the bottom. Votha D. Personal assessment. Do not ask a human how much they can endure. You will not like the answer. He saved the file and closed it, and sat alone in the empty hall, thinking about a species that had walked out of the African savanna with nothing but patience and stubbornness, and had not stopped walking since. The next morning, 14 hours after completing the deadliest endurance course in the Coalition's history, Mara Kessler was in the Academy Gymnasium. She was doing pull-ups. Her ribs ached, and her feet throbbed, and her shoulder protested. With every repetition, but she pulled herself up and lowered herself down, and pulled herself up again. Takani found her there. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, and then he walked over. "What are you training for?" he asked. Mara dropped from the bar and wiped her hands on her shorts. She looked at him and grinned, and it was the most human expression he had ever seen, bright and defiant and completely unbroken. "The next one," she said. Takani shook his head slowly, and something that might have been a laugh or might have been a prayer escaped his mouth. He grabbed the bar next to hers and pulled himself up. If he was going to follow a human, he figured he had better start keeping up.